be more supportive of some of the other, harder reforms like, pension reforms or public service reforms or eliminating public jobs that aren't creating value. That stuff's hard to do. And so I'm cautiously optimistic with what's going on right now in Argentina.
Hello. Welcome again to another episode in the Let People Prosper Show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today we've got another guest who knows a lot about economic freedom, the economy, the world, human freedom, and a lot more. And it's none other than Dr. Matt Mitchell. Matt, welcome to the Let People Prosper Show again.
Hi, Vance. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's really a pleasure to have you back on. And I'll put in the show notes page your first time on, which is a little while now, but we've got a lot more to update. So I said, hey, come back on, Matt. Let's talk about the latest reports. And so it'll be a great discussion for the audience. Before we get into all that, though, let me go and read your bio here, and then we'll jump right into it. So Matt Mitchell is a senior fellow in the Center for Economic Freedom, there at the Fraser Institute, which is based in Canada. He's not in Canada. He's in New Mexico. But he does some great work there. And they do great work overall at Fraser Institute. So go check them out. He received his PhD and master's in economics from George Mason University. I've had a lot of folks from George Mason, so y'all know a lot of those people already. And his BA in political science and BS in economics from Arizona State University. His writing and research focus on economic freedom, public choice economics, and the economics of government favoritism. So with all that great stuff going on, Matt, since you've already been on and I've asked you what motivates you overall, what's motivating you today to do what you're doing?
That's a great question. So I can't remember if I gave this answer last time, but I'm speaking to you from New Mexico. You're in Texas. That's a big part of the story. Yeah. I love my state. It's a beautiful state, rich in culture and history, and the climate's amazing. I'll tell your listeners that if they come here in the summer where I live in northern New Mexico, they'll find that, the temperature never gets above 75. It's just this beautiful, beautiful time to be here. And yet, New Mexico is just surrounded by significantly more prosperous places on all sides, except for Mexico. Yeah. And so the question is, why is it? Why does a place like New Mexico that's, beautiful in so many ways lag behind its neighbors? Why does a place like Mexico that has so much going for it lag behind the states? And so that question really has kind of, burrowed into my head ever since I began traveling, as a kid, and just looking around and seeing the world and seeing this, huge disparity in the human condition. So that's sort of what motivated me to be an economist. Yeah. And a lot of the answer, I think, does have to do with economic freedom. And when I was in graduate school, I studied under Gordon Tullock, who pioneered the research on rent seeking. Yeah. And so it's a really insightful and I think a powerful lens and way to look at the world, but it's also a little bit depressing, right? Yeah. So the whole public choice lens is very, very depressing. And I find that, you can get sort of hopeless if you study public choice a little bit too long, and you need to kind of take a step back and realize that, there's some places, there's some countries and some states that have managed to figure out their public choice problems better than others, that have managed to become more prosperous than others. And so I see these indices as a way to really explore that and to shine a light on that and to better understand how it is that we've solved some of these problems that Gordon Tullock and others talked about in the public choice literature. Yeah, no,
that's fantastic. And you've been doing this for a number of years. And writing on a whole bunch of different topics. And so it's been great to see you now at Fraser Institute and doing all the great work that they've been doing and continuing that over time from Frederick Mann and others that are there, Dean Stanzel and Bob Lawson and a whole bunch of other great folks that have been doing this. And as we talked about before, it was kind of built on some of the work also of like Milton Friedman of getting this economic freedom index kind of started and looking at the different institutional frameworks, which you and I appreciate a lot of the institutional economics. And something else that I'll make sure to put in the show notes page that Pete Betke and I have talked about is kind of y'all's work on mainline economics versus mainstream economics. And I think that's something so important that we need to get back to our roots of thinking about it. Seems like every once in a while we pluck up some of the roots and we go down this mainstream way that seems more populist, if you will, without taking a step back and thinking about what exactly are the mainline economics, the parts of human condition that make us better off. And economic freedom is such a big part of that. But what are some of the other things that really, are foundational to your thoughts and the economic freedom that are there?
Yeah. So I appreciate you mentioning the main line, because I do think that's important. So in the spring, I'm going to be teaching a class at the local college up here. I say high school because some high school students are going to be taking it. And so, it's a very basic, introductory class. If you think about the way that we often teach, microeconomics, even really good textbooks like Cowan and Tabarrok, we just sort of typically you start by just saying, here's supply and demand, and here's how this works. But there's a whole lot that's going on in the background that I don't think we often think to bring out. And so when I teach, I try to bring some of that stuff out, which is that, when you're demanding a product, you're relying on the assumption that if the producer lies to you and sells you a shoddy, bill of goods, that you can rely on the court system to back up that promise. That you can enter into contracts and the court system will honor that. That the government's not going to come along and just take your property or take your business. And so it's easy in some ways to take some of those things for granted when you live in a society where those things work pretty decently well. And so I think one of the insights of the mainline tradition in economics that goes, back to Smith, even before Smith, with the University of Salamanca and others, is the idea that if economics is about exchange, the exchange is mediated through the institutions that we live in. And those institutions themselves, ironically, are the product of exchange, except it's a different type of exchange. It's political exchange. And so some of those institutions are not always conducive to market exchange, and some are. And so that's kind of always going on in the background. And it's nice to try to bring it to the fore whenever we can.
Yeah. I mean, you do a great job of that. And I think, something that I've learned more from you and others in the sense of economic freedom and institutions and the importance of all these things is that it is all around us. I mean, one of the things that I used to, when I taught economics, was always like, look, when I would teach the students, I'd be like, look, you think like an economist, you just don't know it yet. Because they're always making these decisions of marginal cost, marginal benefits. They're acting to improve their condition to where they are today, or they wouldn't have acted, kind of going into praxeology with Loa von Mises and everything. But we just don't see it. And I think, and I think you and I talked about this before on the show, is that we oftentimes get lost in the numbers and maybe some of the charts, when we need to take a step back to figure out like what exactly are the principles, what are the foundations and assumptions that are even going into those models to make out what's happening here. And then we oftentimes as economists do a poor job of looking at, okay, we made these changes. What are the benefits of those changes later on? And I think that's what's great about connecting the dots with the economic freedom of the world index that I want to talk about today, and the economic freedom North America index to talk about, because there is this approach, from my perspective, Matt, and you correct me, but it looks like there is a strong historical case for this, along with the assumptions, but then also finding correlations. I mean, difficult to tease out the causations, as you know, but like we have a lot of correlations of improvements in per capita GDP and improvements in life expectancy and some of the things that we get that, on my show, Let People Prosper, is not just material things, although that's important, but it's also a lot of the other things that we're able to get from economic freedom. What do you say about that, though?
Yeah, so maybe it's helpful to tell a little bit of the story of where some of this came from. So you mentioned Milton Friedman and some of that past. A name that is, near and dear to my heart. A lot of people should know it. Not necessarily well known beyond some of the circles who study this stuff, but is a man named Mike Walker. He was the founder of the Fraser Institute, and he was really the Economic Freedom of the World Index was really his brainchild. And what happened was it was 1984, and they were at the Mont Pelerin Society meetings in I think they were in England. And, it's 1984. So they're discussing the book 1984. Yeah. And, they're debating is economic freedom, does it promote political freedom and vice versa? And they kind of just had to throw their hands up and say, we don't know. And so this room full of, eminent scholars, historians, Nobel laureates, the historian Paul Johnson was there. And they just kind of said, well, we have no way of figuring it out. So they went out afterwards to lunch. It was Mike Walker with the Friedmans. And he said, what if we just measure?
Yeah.
And he said, what? And he said, what if we measure economic freedom? And I think what I understand, it was Rose Friedman, even more than Milton, who said, I love it. Let's figure it out how to do it. And so they held these series of conferences and they developed this index. And it was sort of his idea. And then it took, the hard work of the late Jim Courtney, he passed away earlier this year, and Bob Lawson to really take that vision and make it material and figure out how to do it. So that's when we're talking about economic freedom, that's where it came from. And then over time, they've developed. It wasn't too much long after that. They decided, maybe we need to broaden the idea and also develop a measure of human freedom more broadly. So the way we think about economic freedom is that it's people enjoy more economic freedom or have more economic freedom when they are allowed to make more of their own choices. Okay? Though their choices must respect the choices and rights of others, right? So notice I don't say when they can or when they're able to make their own choices. Yeah. I'm not able to buy an NBA team, right? I don't have that capability now, but I am allowed to. Yeah. Right? The government would permit me to if the opportunity arose. And so so it's really about what we're allowed to do. And then the other thing I noticed is that governments kind of have an ambiguous role in terms of promoting economic freedom. So the government can safeguard my economic freedoms by ensuring that if I enter into a contract with you, that it'll be honored, by ensuring that my property won't be taken so that I can still, I'm allowed to make decisions with my property and that I can use my property. But on the other hand, it can stand in the way of me making my own economic decisions if it puts a regulation or a tax or it becomes the threat to my property, itself through manipulation of the money supply or things like that. So government has this sort of ambiguous role in terms of permitting people to have economic freedom. Now, if you think about economic freedom as the ability to if you are allowed, sorry, I said ability, but I should have said allowed. Okay. Economic freedom means you have more economic freedom when you are allowed to make your own economic choices. Human freedom is just a broader concept, and economic freedom is a part of human freedom. Human freedom means that you are allowed to make choices. Full stop right there. And so this could be a choice about where to live, who to associate with, what kinds of things you want to say and do. And so about 20 years ago, the Economic Freedom of the World Index is going to be 30 years old in 2026. And then 20 years ago, the Human Freedom Index was first published. And that takes the Economic Freedom Index, adds other indicators that look at things like, association and freedom, speech, things like that. Yeah. So you go from 45 indicators to, I think it's 86, still measuring 165 countries. And now we have this broader measure of human freedom, writ large. And that just came out yesterday, actually. Yeah. As we were talking, it came out about a month ago when this released.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I want to get into that too. And maybe set the stage though, just a little bit deeper on the connections of all these, is you had a really good piece out that I'll make sure to put in the show notes. Economic freedom, what is it? How is it measured? And how does it affect our lives? And what's cool about this is you kind of use like this Venn diagram, which I'll put in the show notes page too, but kind of had the human freedom as being kind of the umbrella or the broader oval. And then within that oval, you've got a circle for economic freedom and then personal freedom. And then they have some overlap in between there. And I thought what was cool about this is the overlap between those is two things: to use one's home as a place of work and to use one's body for work. And what's interesting about that to me, Matt, is that both of those go into work. And so some of the things that I talk about here is the dignity that comes with work. And also from my more Christian perspective, as I think there's a part of us was created to be fruitful and multiply. And so work was so important to that. And I just thought it was fascinating that those two things that overlap between those had to do with work. But I wanted to get your perspective on it, man.
Yeah, that's a great point. So one thing I'd note, by the way, is that I don't at all claim that, I've got the list of personal freedoms and economic freedoms, and then the intersection of the two. These are not in any way exhaustive lists.
Sure.
So think of this as during the debate during the Constitution, there was this idea that, well, the problem with the Constitution, you mentioned George Mason. The original George Mason didn't want to support the final Constitution because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. And then other people said, well, we can't have a Bill of Rights because if you tried to name all the rights of people, you'd inevitably leave anything out. Yeah. And that could be a problem because if you left something out, then people would assume that you don't have that right. And so Madison came up with the idea of the Ninth Amendment and said, no, we'll solve it. We'll just say that the enumeration in this Constitution of certain rights is not meant to disparage or deny any rights retained by the people. And everybody was like, okay, all right, that works. And so the enumeration of those economic and personal freedoms, I don't mean to indicate that that's an exhaustive list. But there's a couple of things I kind of want to emphasize there. One is that economic freedom is a human freedom, right? The right to buy and to sell and to exchange with others, you can't separate that out and say that it's not a right of being just a human being. And this is important, again, in a constitutional sense, because if you look at what the sometimes they're called the second generation of founding fathers. These are the people who came along after the Civil War. They were kind of a mix of radical Republicans and more moderate Republicans, but they were really, really intent on trying to protect the rights of former slaves. And of course, slavery is denying a personal and economic freedom, the right to use your body, the right to use your labor, right? It's right at that intersection in that Venn diagram. And so that generation of leaders was intent on preserving people's rights to exchange and to be able to, go into other parts of the country and start businesses and to compete and all of that. And there's a really fascinating, I think, legal literature that looks at the protection of economic liberties or economic freedoms. Unfortunately, from a constitutional perspective, they're often given sort of second-class status in terms of rights. There's the Supreme Court over time has said that there are certain fundamental rights, and then there are other rights. and unfortunately, economic freedom is often not considered a fundamental right. As you can tell, I think otherwise. I think it should be considered a fundamental right. So that's number one, is the idea that economic freedom is part of human freedom. And then just to emphasize that economic freedom is important, but it's not the only thing that matters. There are other things that people would say, well, it's not really an economic decision. Who you're going to choose as your partner. In some maybe messed up relationships, that's an entirely economic decision. But for most of us, that shouldn't be an economic decision, right? But that needs to be protected as well. And so that's where the Human Freedom Index comes in, and we try to relate the two concepts. Yeah,
and even though I mentioned, like, I'm a Christian, so I kind of look at it from a Christian worldview, there's also the freedom to, as you mentioned, as you note here, to worship or refrain from worship. I mean, that's also really important in the terms of human freedom and what's going on in a country and everything else. And I think, having the rule of law, having some forms of government are important, although, like from a classical liberal, more libertarian standpoint, I wouldn't limit a government as possible. But there are those the forms of government that are upholding, hopefully, those freedoms over time, which is important. And it's also important with the rest of the country, rest of the globe. When we're thinking about other countries, we have those places like Venezuela and others that are very low, if not at the very bottom, who don't have those same human freedoms or economic freedoms, and therefore, personal freedoms or economic freedoms that then become the human freedom and pushes them very low to the bottom. Whereas, for example, I was just looking over this. When you look at the economic freedom rankings, and these are for 2022, it's always a lag just because of the data and everything else. But you've got, and in the world index, we've got Hong Kong, Singapore, Switzerland, New Zealand, and then the United States being number 5. And it's always interesting. I think we talked a little bit about this before, but some of your more Nordic countries, when you think about Switzerland and Denmark and others, they get a bad rap as far as maybe having socialist healthcare, nationalized healthcare, and other things. But when you take a bigger look at their economy, their sound money, their tax code and regulations, there's a lot more freedom that's going on than meets the eye. And so I wonder kind of what are your perspectives, or when you're looking at the economic freedom of the world, what are some of the key things that you like to look at?
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so you just said a lot there, and I want to first respond to something really early on that you were saying, and then I'll get to your point at the end. So you were talking about kind of the conceptual overlap between Christianity and the idea of rights. One thing that's really important here is this is not a religious perspective. The human rights are human rights, whether you're Christian, Muslim, or non-denominational at all. But the concept that the founding fathers, of course, used because it was sort of in the intellectual air of the Enlightenment. John Locke had written about it. Is the idea of a natural right. And the important thing here, if you come at it from a religious perspective, is that these are God-given rights, but you don't have to be religious. You can say that you can still have humans because they have dignity, and atheists believe in the dignity of humans, right? If you have dignity, you have rights, and the important thing is those rights precede the government. So, if you look at the way even the Bill of Rights is structured, the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment, does not say that you now have the right to bear arms. Yeah. Congress grants you that right. Nope, doesn't say that. Instead, it says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. That's the First Amendment. Yeah. So it doesn't say you have the right to religion. It says Congress shall make no law infringing on that. And when it comes to the Second Amendment, it says Congress shall not, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Yeah. So it's the idea that you have these rights. We're not declaring that you have rights. We're just here to protect them. And that is important because, again, it goes back to that James Madison concern about the Ninth Amendment. We do not want to rely on the government, which is, of course, as Max Weber taught us, it's that institution with a monopoly on legitimate use of violence. You don't want to rely on the government to tell us what rights we do and do not have. We have rights, and we can demand them as humans because we believe that all humans have rights because of the dignity of being humans, and then we ask government to protect them. Okay, so I just wanted to tie that together.
I love it. That was good.
So then, back to your question, about, the Scandinavian countries, and you look at places like Venezuela that are lacking in economic freedom. You could also, it's important to look at Hong Kong and Singapore that are top of the EFW list. So what's going on here? A couple of things. One, in terms of Hong Kong and Singapore being in the top of the Economic Freedom of the World Index, people often raise their hand when I give talks, and they say, "Whoa, hold on. I've read a little bit about Singapore, and they don't seem like a very free place." Yeah. Or I've read a little bit about Hong Kong, and that's why we have the Human Freedom Index. Economic freedom matters. It's not the only thing that matters. If you are in Hong Kong right now, you can start a business. It's easier to start a business. You're going to face lower taxes, fewer regulations than almost anywhere else in the world. Yeah. It's not so easy to protest the government. Yeah. It's not so easy to associate or to write whatever you want in the press. Okay. And so the human freedom reflects that. Now, Hong Kong used to be at the top of both lists. I think it was number 3 in human freedom as recently as 2011, I believe. And now it's down to 50. Wow. And it slid 10 slots from 2021 to 2022. So that reflects the Chinese Communist Party's crackdown, on civil freedoms that we've seen in the last few years. It's also started to bleed over into economic freedom. You can only limit personal freedom so much without impacting the way that people start to associate through businesses in a commercial sense. However, it still is the top of the list. So,
and just real quick on that, I was just looking, right? It shows that the score went down, right, to 8.58, the way it's ranking, whereas Singapore went up to 8.55. So it could be soon that Singapore tops Hong Kong if the trend continues.
That's right. And so that's another factor that's going on here is, so from 2019 to 2022, basically most of the world, as you know, lost both human and economic freedom as governments worked to try to control the global pandemic. Yeah. And we can debate whether that was a good idea or not. The fact is that it did happen, and it clearly shows up in the numbers. Now, with every country in the world restricting economic freedom, Hong Kong probably benefited from that a little bit, because just as they're cracking down on both civil and economic freedoms, their relative ranking doesn't look so bad because everybody else was also cracking down. So that's a factor.
Yeah, definitely.
And then finally, to your question about the Scandinavian countries. So these are countries that have large governments. That's for sure. They have relatively high tax rates and relatively high spending rates. They, however, have extremely good protection of persons and property. Their legal systems and the rule of law are really second to none. They have low barriers to international trade. They have sound money. They have relatively limited regulations. You want to start and run a business, it's in these countries, it's relatively easy to do it. And then even on the size of government, they do have large governments, but they do it differently than a lot of people think, right? So these are governments with relatively high marginal tax rates that start at a very low level, at a relatively low level. So they are not tax the rich governments. They are tax the everyone governments. Really. So they rely on high marginal tax rates that start low, the income tax rates, and they rely on consumption taxes that everyone pays. One thing I would suggest to Western, North American audiences as they're looking to these countries is, if you like what they're doing, then we should have a conversation about that. It's an interesting conversation. You have to recognize that you can't achieve these levels of growth in GDP without, relatively high levels of economic freedom. And then the other thing you have to recognize is that they're not doing it the way that you want to do it here. And they're doing it with very different tax schemes. And then finally, I'd note that in the 70s and early 80s, both Denmark and Sweden found themselves in a lot of trouble. And they radically changed. They had very high taxes, very high spending, but it still wasn't. The taxes weren't high enough to meet the spending, and so they had big deficits and huge debts. And they got their fiscal house in order. They deregulated actually, and so again, that's another thing to emulate. When they were closer to actual socialism, they weren't doing so well. Then when they moved in a more market-oriented direction, things got better.
Nice. Yeah. And one of the, you've had a couple good reports out, one of those being on Estonia, looking at that, and, the score went down to 7.67, but they're still 20th now. And not too long ago, they're much lower in the rankings as they've made key reforms over time. But I want to give you an opportunity to discuss Estonia just for a little bit here.
Yeah. So I love the story of Estonia. It's such a fascinating country. And so one of the things you mentioned earlier, the idea of causation and correlation. And I'm, I believe that we need to be modest whenever we're talking about any kind of empirical claim. Yeah. And so it's quite possible that, the wealthiest countries in the world just happen to then choose relatively low tax rates and relatively low regulatory burdens and protection of and good protection of persons and property. And that maybe causation runs in that direction. It's entirely possible. If nothing else, the existence of the economic freedom, these correlations suggest that you don't have major problems when you cut your taxes or your regulations. But there are cases like Estonia where you see a country that, back in 1991, they were the 90th, most free country in the world, that were a socialist planned economy. The government owned everything, down to your home. You didn't have a personal property right in your home. People were allowed only 9 square feet. And if you had more than per person, if you had more than that, they moved people in. And so then they went on this bold experiment where they privatized everything that they could, honoring original property rights as best they could. So there's we tell a story of a widow who went into her backyard and dug up a tin that she had buried back in the 1940s when the communists had come in, and opened it up, and it has a deed to her property. And she took it down to the local government and said, "See, my husband and I own this property, 40 years ago." And the government said, "Yep, you did. And congratulations, you own it again now." So, they just they really prioritized, getting property back into private hands. They unilaterally, and this is unprecedented in the modern world, unilaterally and completely opened to free trade. They had the most ambitious monetary reforms with a currency board that tied their currency to the Deutsche Mark, and they instantly had broke the back of 200% inflation just like that. They introduced the world's first flat tax. So
and
really,
it was more like consumption based, the way that they formed it, wasn't it?
Yeah. So as I understand it, the way it works is it's an income tax, but it's also a business tax, and it's only on distributed profits.
Yeah.
So essentially, one way to think about this is it's 100% complete expensing. Is you don't have to worry anything that you make. It's only any business decision that you make that you have to spend money on. That's not going to be taxed. It's only taxed when the profits are distributed. Mm-hmm. So really innovative reforms. Yeah. And if you going back to this idea of correlation versus causation, the results speak for themselves. Now they are, they have the more unicorns, that is businesses worth over $1 billion per capita than any country in Europe, wow. More startups than any country in Europe. They're by far the wealthiest former Soviet republic. They have, some of the fastest growth rates in the world, extremely high levels of achievement in terms of their students are the best educated in the world. Yeah. Their environment was recently ranked the cleanest environment in the wow. world, which is extraordinary in itself because the Soviets had just absolutely obliterated the environment. And that's actually one of the reasons. That was a huge impetus for the protests. Wow. Is the initial protests to try to separate from the Soviet Union were environmental protests. It was called the Phosphates Spring. A good example, by the way, from what I understand, the type of mining that the Soviets wanted to do in Estonia, it was very low yield. The soil does not produce very, very good minerals. And if you had run it through any sort of a cost benefit analysis, you wouldn't have done it. But they don't use a cost benefit analysis. Instead, they use a political analysis, and they wanted to bring in more Russians to Russify Estonia. And they wanted to just, sort of make work projects. So they were ordering more mining. And they had these huge piles of radioactive material all over Estonia that was leaching into the water and into the air. And so they started protesting in 1987. Wow. And that was strategic in part to start with these environmental protests, because they knew that the communists they weren't protesting communism. Yeah. Per se, and so the communists would let it go, particularly in light of the openness, policy of Gorbachev. But that snowballed, wow. And they then were able to leverage that into other more substantive critiques of the regime itself and of communism itself.
Wow, yeah.
So you have this example, of okay, maybe correlation is not causation, right. But we do have plenty of examples of places that went from unfree to free, and lo and behold, radically changed. You start to see these. You marry the case studies with the empirical, regularities, and now you can start to say, okay, I think it's relatively safe to infer some degree of causation here. Yeah, economic freedom might be causing some prosperity.
And there's a lot of. You might actually know the number of citations that are in academic journals now. It's off the charts, right?
Yeah, it's so the original, the EFW index in one form or another. I believe it's got over 12,000 citations, wow. And it's got 1,000. This I think is even better. It's got 1,000 studies done by other academics out there in the world using it to assess the effect of economic freedom on human well-being, one way or another. So it's looking at anything from poverty and growth and income levels to life expectancy, infant mortality, cultural attributes. And this sort of surprises me. So, for example, it turns out that people seem to be less materialistic in economically free societies, which kind of, surprises me. I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that.
Yeah, me too.
Maybe if the basic necessities of life are hard to come by, you tend to, put a lot of emphasis on those. And so that may be one explanation.
And it might go into like the human freedom part as well, to where kind of like prosperity isn't just material things. Like, yes, it's important, but we also want to have, religious freedom. We want to have social freedoms and other things that we get benefits from that are not just material things. Because I think it's kind of an interesting point, though, too, Matt, because I think what folks will think about free market capitalism is just about material things. Like greed is, they're all greedy and everything else. But what you're telling me and what some of the research and everything is showing is that, well, it's much more than that though. And so if you're pigeonholing free market capitalism into just greed, you're missing out on all of the other benefits that come with it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one way we can start to shine a light on this is some of the research on happiness or life satisfaction. So one of the things that we find is that the degree, people are more satisfied with their lives if they live in economically free places relative to unfree places. Yeah. And you might say, okay, well, that's just because they're wealthier. If you're 9 times wealthier because you live in a free place versus an unfree place, of course you're going to be more satisfied. That could be the case. However, it seems to be that that's not the causal mechanism here. It seems to be that and one way we can tell this is there's some studies that look at the inequality of life satisfaction. So in the same way that they use the statistical technique of a Gini coefficient, which we use a lot to measure income inequality, people have looked at have calculated Gini coefficients of life satisfaction inequality. And life satisfaction is actually more equal in more free societies. So to me, that suggests that, what is making people happier in a more free society is not just that they have higher incomes, but back to this idea of dignity. People want agency. Yeah. They want to be able to make their own choices. And when you have the freedom to exchange with whomever you want, to start a business and to run it how you want, to enter into contracts with whomever you want, and to be, safe in your person and your property, to not have your property expropriated through inflation, unexpected inflation. Those kinds of freedoms, people like that. Gives them agency over their life, even if it doesn't make them a billionaire. It does seem to make them happy.
Yeah, love it. All right. So we're kind of wrapping up, man. Time flies whenever you're having fun here. Yeah. But two other things I want to chat about real quick is one is Argentina. And, Argentina ranks 159th in the latest report. Of course, this is 2022 data, so we don't have the latest from 2023 and what's going on with Javier Milei coming in and making all these key reforms. And I just wonder, I don't know, what's been your impression of what's going on after you've been studying this for so long and everything else? And it just seems, for me, I've been really excited about it. I'm excited to see what happens. I'm cautiously optimistic sometimes, but the things that I've seen, not only what he's been able to do there as quickly as he has, but also the results from balancing the budget and having more economic growth and reining in inflation. All these things are indicating to me that we're on the precipice of something great in Argentina. But I wonder if you're optimistic or if you're cautiously optimistic or what you're thinking.
No, it's a great question. So I'm cautiously optimistic. If you take a step back, these kinds of experiments were happening all the time in the 1990s, even in the early 2000s with Georgia. But, I've mentioned Estonia. There's the other Baltic countries, Latvia and Lithuania are not far behind. There was Georgia, which is now backsliding quite a bit, unfortunately. But then there was Southeast Asia. All these countries were making radical reforms, and seeing results. And then from the year about 2000 onward, we just didn't see experiments like this going on anymore. Wealthy, relatively free countries like the US and the UK and Canada basically just kind of stayed put. And then nobody else moved much. Wow. Now, in some ways, we're going back with Argentina. It's an example of going back to what was going on in the early 1990s. And if you had asked me a year ago if I was optimistic, I would have said probably no.
Yeah, okay.
To say. Okay. And the reason is it didn't look like his coalition was very broad. Yeah. It looked to me like he kind of got in by accident to some degree. And then I think he had less than 30% of the legislature. So I didn't see how he was going to make this happen. And somehow he's managed to do quite a bit. He now has over 50% approval rating. Yeah. I was in Buenos Aires last month. Okay. And the mood is really quite optimistic. Okay. So being able to go from 200% inflation a month to 2% inflation a month, people are quite happy about that. That's tangible. They see it. being able, the reforms in terms of lifting price controls on housing and not seeing housing prices go up, but actually see people be able to get fill the house, take care of the housing crisis.
Yeah.
Like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
It's awesome to see that. And you mentioned, balanced budgets. He's done quite a bit to, I think, buy people's, get buy-in.
Yeah.
It's, one of the things that we mentioned, that we wrote about when we were talking about Estonia was that, under communism, the typical person got up in the wrong city, went to the wrong company and did the wrong job.
Yeah.
And wrong in the sense of not something that consumers want, not actually creating value that other humans voluntarily will exchange money for. And that's really problematic because that means that person is going to face a hard awakening, and they've been lured by the government into doing the wrong things. And now under a free market, they might face huge dislocations. Yeah. And of course, in Estonia and elsewhere, there was a lot of alcoholism. There was a lot of crime in the early transition. And so it's not easy. No, I'm not claiming that these things can happen. These positive changes can happen without disruption and pain.
Yeah.
So in order to overcome that, what's really nice is to see that policymakers are able to make some down payments on it through things like opening up trade, getting, breaking the back of inflation. Those types of things help consumers get buy-in and voters get buy-in, and then be more supportive of some of the other, harder reforms like, pension reforms or public service reforms, or eliminating public jobs that aren't creating value. That stuff's hard to do. And so I'm cautiously optimistic with what's going on right now.
Nice. In Argentina. Good. And what I'm hopeful for is we're getting ready to have the inauguration of the new Trump administration coming in, is that it also allows for more competition. I like the idea of there's more competition in the marketplace, and Trump in particular feeds off of that. And so I'm hopeful that maybe things that are going to Javier Milei of cutting programs and other things will actually help incentivize Trump, who typically does not care about spending. As someone who was at OMB and trying to get him to care, he just didn't. But it seems like maybe there are even some spillover effects in the United States when you think about the DOE's, the Department of Government Efficiency, with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. I mean, maybe, just maybe, there might be some spillover effects here.
Yeah. I mean, I saw Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, the other day. Javier Milei likes to use a chainsaw. It looked to me like he was taking a circular saw, but it was a electrical piece of equipment,
like in his office too. Red tape. Like stuff was just going everywhere.
Yeah. And so, I'd like to see these spillover effects. I really hope that Trump doesn't follow through with the tariff threats. Right. I hope that, maybe he looks at Javier Milei, who's cutting barriers to trade, and potentially sees another path. We'll see. I think the history with him is that you can't take him literally, which is hard to say about anybody, that you just shouldn't believe what they say. But I think some of the lesson of the first term is don't believe everything he says.
That's a good point. All right. So wrapping up here now, is we also had the Economic Freedom of North America, which is always near and dear to my heart. We have the Economic Freedom of North America conference every year up at Southern Methodist University, which I've been going basically since I think 2014, nearly every year. And we had a great discussion there again this year. And then the report just came out here recently, looking at the top 5. We have New Hampshire, South Dakota, Florida, Tennessee, Texas, and North Carolina is number 9. Anyway, there's some of the key states that we would think would be up there are there. There was even some improvements in the scores, which I think were good, heading in the right direction. Of course, on the flip side of this, you've got Puerto Rico is last, but of the 50 contiguous United States, including Alaska and Hawaii, New York is at the bottom. and California is right behind them. So they're 49 and 50. And this also shows, I think, even for folks who are listening who maybe haven't visited other countries, but they visited other states, or they see where people are moving to, and people move with their feet. They're incentivized to go from one place to the next. And being in Texas, we see a lot of people moving to Texas. On average, still about 1,000 people a day are moving to Texas from other states. So, but I want to get your perspective as you've dove into this for a number of years now and looking at this. What are some of the key things that pop out to you about what's happening across the United States?
Yeah. So, first of all, we have to recognize that this is a much more narrow spectrum. It's not as great a variation in economic freedom. If you go from New Hampshire to New York, you're still going to have your property well protected. You're not likely to have your business expropriated. You're still going to be able to, relying on the same monetary regime. So if there may be some inflation in the last few years, but that's easing. You're still going to encounter the same rules for trade internationally, but there is still, significant variation within those bounds among the states.
And Matt, it's more like you have the federal government that's the same no matter which state you're in. So you have the ceteris paribus, all things else held constant, and then you can kind of isolate what's happening around the states, right?
That's right. That's right. And so that's one of the reasons why we don't see as significant a variation across the states in terms of per capita income, say, for free and unfree states. But the other major factor here, and you highlighted it, is the ability to move. So one of the things that just is really stark here is people tend to want to leave unfree places and they tend to want to go to free places. And that is true both internationally and within the states. And so the population growth and employment growth in the freest U.S. states is orders of magnitude higher than in the least free states. Now, then the other thing that goes on there, if you think about it mathematically, so, when we talk about GDP per capita or income per capita is Latin, for per head. So per person, right? And if you have a bunch of people flowing into Texas, that adds to the denominator. And so that tends to you don't see as big of a differences. But what we do see is, people are starting more businesses. They're starting more jobs and creating more jobs, and income overall is growing in the freer states relative to the unfree states. And then there's as with the EFW, there's all these kind of interesting, fun, empirical analyses that people have done over the years. Everything from homelessness being correlated with economic freedom at the state level to lower BMI. People seem to be healthier in freer states relative to unfree states. Higher levels of self-reported happiness, lower levels of poverty. So a lot of good things that come along with prosperity seem to, again, correlate there. And then you see states. The other thing that's kind of interesting to highlight here is that I do think, in the international economic literature, one of the things we talk about is government is the resource curse. Governments extracting wealth. So you'll find places, that have they're really rich in resources, but have poor institutions. The government can extract the wealth and essentially try to get away with bad policy. So you see that in the Middle East, for example. Well, I think you can see that to some degree in the States. So some of the least free states are places like where I'm sitting, New Mexico. It's a beautiful place. You should come here and visit. Absolutely gorgeous. I think the government is extracting some of the wealth from the state through the resource curse. Essentially getting away with bad policy because we're the second highest producer of oil in the country with the Permian Basin. We've got all these assets in terms of the culture and the sunshine and the people, and you can get away with having bad policy when you have such good a lot going for you in those respects.
Yeah, because New Mexico is ranked 47th. I wouldn't necessarily expect that. I mean, I've been looking at this for a number of years now, so I know it. But at the same time, I wouldn't expect that being in the South and everything else that's going on. And, I also do a lot of work with the Pelican Institute in Louisiana. Louisiana's one that's also not ranked very high when you think about the South and what's going on. And there's a lot of policies that they're changing. I think they just flattened their income tax at 3%. There's a flat corporate income tax rate now at 5.5%. And kind of this flat tax revolution happening across the country, I think could also help to improve a lot of the rankings, or at least the scores. Because as you mentioned earlier, it's all relative. So if they're all improving, the rankings may not necessarily improve, but I think there will be improvements over time. And I also do a lot of work with Kansas, the Kansas Policy Institute. They're doing some interesting things there. But a lot of this too, Matt, is because the big three items for states are government spending, taxation, and then labor market regulation, right? And the labor market regulation is something that also really worries me in a lot of these places, because going back to dignity of work, kind of coming full circle, is that there are limitations in many of these states that even though they may be getting a lot of their spending and taxation right, the labor market regulation is also a big factor. And some of the folks that I've had come on, Matt, and talk about like what are their big issues that they think are holding us back the most is regulation. Like John Taylor, Peter Bettke. I mean, some of the other names that I've talked to on here, regulation has been a driving factor. I didn't expect that, to be honest with you, but it really has been. And I wonder what your thoughts are here as we kind of, wrap up.
Yeah. So I 100% agree with that. And you're sitting in Texas, which is, considered a relatively free state, but they're not great on occupational licensure regulation. And so, yes, there's a famous paper that came out in the 80s that basically makes the case that what governments can do through taxation and spending, they can also do through regulation. And so they often use the power of government to regulate when they don't want to put it on the books. Because the difference is that it's a regulation is so much more difficult to understand. It doesn't show up on the books as a cost. And so it's a big problem. And quite often is something that's really concerning to me is that regulations tend to be regressive. So, and by that I mean they tend to stand in the way of low income people, people who have other problems that might make them less likely to progress. So non-native speakers, people who might have a criminal background. Those folks are much more new entrants, new firms, people who are starting new businesses. They tend to be stymied by regulations in a way that they're not necessarily stymied by the tax code, and that's a huge problem, because that's the upward progress, the dynamism that our economy relies on is people starting new businesses, starting ventures, being able to start a business in your garage. The way Bill Gates started a business in Albuquerque and then ended up moving. We're not very friendly to business. That we rely on that, but there's a lot of regulations, occupational licensing regulations, land use regulations that make it difficult for you to start a business in your garage, and make it even more difficult if you don't speak the language. If you're not willing to spend in New Mexico, you have to spend 4 years, as much time as a doctor spends in medical school, 4 years to be an HVAC repair person. 4 years if you want to learn how to install drywall. I'm not all that handy, but I can install drywall, and I guarantee you, I haven't studied it for 4 years. That's a big problem. These are the paths to upward mobility, and regulations are often blocking them.
Yeah. Awesome, man. It's always a pleasure talking with you, Matt. Thank you for all the work you're doing. And where's the best place for people to find you and everything?
So freetheworld.com or freetheworld.org. You just plug that in. You'll go straight to the Fraser Institute's website, where you can find our Economic Freedom of the World Index, Human Freedom Index, and the Economic Freedom in North America. I also work with the Knee Center at West Virginia University, where we're studying regulations, occupational licensure, and certificate of need laws, and barriers to entry. So you can go either place and you'll find
Great. Yeah, I've had Ed Timmons on, who's also awesome. And so we had a great discussion about that as well. Thank you for everything you're doing, Matt. And we'll talk about this again, hopefully again, maybe next year, whenever the new reports come out. It's always important to think about economic freedom and the benefits that it gains from many different levels, not only just the material prosperity, as we talked about some today, but some other things as well that we also talked about. So I appreciate all the work that you're doing. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and God bless you and your family, Matt.
Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks so much. Well, for the audience, I hope you enjoyed our discussion. Go out and give us a 5-star rating and share with your friends and family. They too need to understand more about economic freedom. And I hope you all have a blessed and prosperous start to 2025. And until next time, let people prosper.